evening to you all, and welcome to Circle River's production of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. What you are about to watch is the efforts of over 25 performers from throughout the country who are dedicated to continuing the arts of theater and storytelling during these difficult times. It is our hope that this ghostly tale will not only entertain and be a pleasant distraction, but that it will also remind you of the true spirit of this holiday season. May it reaffirm your belief in love, family, and compassion to your fellow men. From us all at Circle River, we wish you and yours. Listen.
Allow me, before I commence, to express two wishes. The first is that you will have the kindness, by a great stretch of the imagination, to imagine this, a small social party, assembled to hear a tale told round the Christmas fire. And secondly, that if you feel disposed as we go along to give expression to any emotion, whether grave or gay, you will do so with perfect freedom from restraint and without the least apprehension of disturbing me. Nothing can be so delightful to me on such occasions as the assurance that my hearers accompany me with something of the pleasure and interest I shall have in conducting them. And believe me, I cannot desire anything so much as the establishment amongst us, from the very beginning, of a perfectly unfettered, cordial, friendly sentiment.
Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon the exchange for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind you, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hand shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and Marley were partners for many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, sole administrator, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, and sole mourner. Yet even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by this sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come from the story I am going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night upon his own ramparts, quite literally to astonish his son's weak mind, than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman strolling after dark in a breezy place. Say, St. Paul's churchyard, for instance. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name above the door, and the firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley, but he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Scrooge was a tight-fisted, hand at the grindstone, squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. He was as hard and as sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. He was secret, self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, and stiffened his gait. It made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and he spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature with him always and didn't thaw at 1 degree at Christmas. Heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm him. No wintry weather could chill him. No wind was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain less open to entreaty. Heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say, with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him. No children asked him the time. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired of Scrooge the way to such and such a place. Even the blind men's dogs would tug their owners into doorways or alleyways when they saw him coming. They would wag their tails as if to say, "No eye is better than an evil eye, master." What did Scrooge care? It was all the very thing he liked to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance. It was agreeable to Scrooge. Once upon a time, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. The weather was cold, bleak, biting, and foggy as well. He could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and candles were flaring in the windows of the neighboring offices, like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole, and was so dense without that across the narrow court, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. To see the dingy cloud obscuring everything, one might have thought that nature lived close by and was brewing on a large scale. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open, that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, Bob Cratchit, who was copying letters in a dismal cell beyond. Scrooge had a very small fire, but Bob's fire was so much smaller that it looked like one coal. Bob couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room. And if Bob came in with a shovel so that he might replenish his own fire, the master predicted it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore Bob put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle. Not being a man of strong imagination, he failed.
A cheerful voice cried,
"A Merry Christmas, Uncle. God save you."
It was Scrooge's nephew, Fred. Scrooge hadn't heard him approach. Scrooge said,
Humbug!
Fred had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again.
"Christmas a humbug? Uncle, you don't mean that, I am sure."
I do. Merry Christmas? What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough.
"What right have you to be dismal? You're rich enough."
Ah, humbug! I live in a world of fools. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older but not an hour richer? A time for balancing your books and having every item through a dozen rounds of months presented dead against you? Every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled in his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart.
Uncle.
Nephew, keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine.
Keep it? But you don't keep it.
Let me leave it alone then. Much good may it do you. Much good has it ever done you.
There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say. but I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a kind, forgiving, charitable time. The only time, it seems, when men and women open their shut up hearts freely, and to think of people below them, as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. Therefore, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good, and will do me good, and I say, God bless it.
Bob Cratchit involuntarily applauded. Becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety, he poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever.
Let me hear another sound from you, and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation.
Scrooge turned to his nephew.
You're quite a powerful speaker, sir. It's a wonder you don't go into Parliament.
Don't be angry, Uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow.
Scrooge went the whole length of the expression, stating he would see him in that extremity first.
But why, Uncle, why?
Why did you get married?
Because I fell in love?
Because you fell in love.
His manner implied that falling in love was the only thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas.
Good afternoon.
Nay, Uncle, but you never came to see me before that happened. Why give it as a reason for not coming now? I want nothing from you. Why can we not be friends?
Good afternoon.
I am sorry to find you so resolute. We have never had any quarrel, to which I have been a party, but I have made the trial an homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humor to the last. A Merry Christmas to you, Uncle, and a Happy New Year.
Good afternoon.
His nephew left the room without an angry word, stopping only at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on Bob Cratchit, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge. For he returned them cordially. Hearing this, Scrooge muttered,
Oh, there's another fellow, my clerk, with 15 shillings a week and a wife and family talking about a merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam.
When Bob Cratchit left Scrooge's nephew out, he let in two portly gentlemen, who took their hats off and entered Scrooge's office. One of the gentlemen spoke. Scrooge and Marley's, I believe. At this festive season of the year, it is especially desirable to make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly. We are raising funds to buy them some meat and drink and a means of warmth. Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley? Scrooge replied,
Mr. Marley died 7 years ago this very night.
The gentleman said, we have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner. That much was certainly true, for they had been two kindred spirits. But at the ominous word liberality, Scrooge frowned and shook his head and asked,
Are there no prisons? Are the union workhouses still in operation?
There are, still, returned the gentleman. I wish I could say there were not, but they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body. There are many who can't go there, and many would rather die.
I'm very glad. I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course. I don't make myself merry at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the prisons and workhouses. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. And if they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. This is not my business. It's enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere with other people's. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
The men saw clearly it would be useless to pursue their point, and they withdrew.
The fog and darkness thickened, so that people ran about with flaring torches, proffering their services to go before horse-drawn carriages and light the way. The ancient church tower, which always peeped slyly down at Scrooge, became invisible. Its bells struck the hours and quarters in the clouds with tremulous vibrations, as if its teeth were chattering in its frozen head. The cold became intense. At the corner of the court, some laborers had lighted a great fire in a brazier, around which a party of ragged men and boys were gathered. They warmed their hands before the blaze in rapture. The fire plug, being left in solitude, its overflow sullenly congealed and turned to misanthropic ice. In the brightness of the shops, holly sprigs and berries crackled in the lamp heat of the windows. Poulterers' and grocers' trades became a glorious pageant, with which it was impossible to believe such dull principles as bargain and sale had anything to do. The Lord Mayor gave orders to his 50 cooks and butlers in the stronghold of the mansion house to keep Christmas as a Lord Mayor's household should. Even the tailor, whom the previous Monday the Lord Mayor had fined 5 shillings for being drunk and bloodthirsty in the streets, stirred up tomorrow's pudding in his garret, while his lean wife and the baby ventured out to buy the beef. It grew foggier yet and colder. A young man stopped at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol.
God bless you, merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay.
Scrooge struck a ruler at the door, and the young man fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog and frost. Finally, the hour of shutting up the counting house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool. An expectant Bob Cratchit instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat.
Tomorrow is Christmas. If quite convenient, sir. It's only once a year.
A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. It's not convenient, and it's not fair. If I was to withhold a half-crown of your pay for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound. And yet you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work? But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier the next morning.
Bob Cratchit promised that he would, and Scrooge buttoned his greatcoat to the chin and walked out with a growl. Bob, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat, ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt.
Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. His chambers had once belonged to his deceased partner. It was a gloomy suite of rooms in a building that was old and dreary. Nobody lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms being all let out as offices. There was nothing particular about Scrooge's door knocker on the door, except that it was very large. Yet, when Scrooge had his key in the door lock, he saw not a knocker, but Marley's face, not angry or ferocious, but just as Marley had looked in life, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. The eyes were wide open and perfectly motionless, and that made it horrible. But its horror seemed beyond its control rather than a part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly, then it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled would be untrue, but none the less he lighted his candle, walked in, and closed the door with a bang which resounded through the house. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked slowly up the stairs, trimming his candle in the gloomy darkness as he went. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. Before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. All were as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, nobody in the closet. There was a small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and the little saucepan of gruel on the hob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in. Double locked himself in, which was not his custom. Then he put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap.
Humbug,
said Scrooge, and walked across the room. There was a disused bell hanging in the room, and it began to swing, ringing softly at first, so that it barely made a sound, then loudly, and so did every bell in the house. The ringing stopped, and was succeeded by a clanking of chains deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Then came the sound of the cellar door flying open with a booming sound. The noise grew much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. Scrooge said,
it's humbug still, and I won't believe it.
Through the door came on a ghost with Marley's face. Marley in his usual waistcoat, tights, and boots. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge could see through it, could feel the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes. Scrooge marked a folded kerchief bound about the spirit's head and chin, which he had not observed before. He fought against his senses. Scrooge was as caustic and cold as ever.
What do you want with me? Who are you?
Ask me who I was.
Who were you then?
In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley.
I don't believe in you because the senses are cheats. A little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You might be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are.
Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel very brave right then. The truth is that he tried to be smart, as a means of keeping down his terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. There was something very awful, too, in the spectre's being, which gave it an infernal atmosphere of its own. Scrooge could not feel it, but although the ghost sat motionless, its hair and clothing were agitated as by the hot vapor from an oven.
Humbug, I tell you, humbug!
At this, the spirit raised a frightful cry and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling noise. Then, to Scrooge's horror, the phantom took the bandage from around its head as if it were too warm to wear indoors. Its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast.
Man of the worldly mind, do you believe in me or not?
Scrooge fell upon his knees, clasped his hands before his face, and said,
I do believe in you, but why do you trouble me? Why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?
It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad amongst his fellow men. And if that spirit does not go forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth and turn to happiness. I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Or would you know the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? 7 Christmas Eves ago, it was as heavy and as long as mine. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain.
Scrooge trembled more and more.
Jacob, tell me more. Speak comfort to me.
I have none to give. That comes from other regions. Ebenezer Scrooge. Nor can I tell you what I would. Only a very little more is permitted for me to say. I cannot rest. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark my words. In life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole. And weary journeys lie before me.
Scrooge pondered what the ghost had said, but did not lift his eyes or get off his knees. There was humility and deference in his voice when he spoke.
Oh, you must have been very slow about it, Jacob. 7 years dead and traveling all the time. You might have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years.
Whole time. No rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse. I travel on the wings of the wind.
The ghost cried out and clanked its chain so hideously in the dead silence of the night that the ward would have been justified in indicting it for a nuisance.
Oh, captive, bound, and double iron, not to know any Christian spirit, working kindly in its little sphere wherever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that this, his earth, must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one life's opportunity misused. Yet such was I. Oh, such was I.
But you were always a good man of business, Jacob.
Business? Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business.
The ghost held up its chain at arm's length, as if that were the cause of its grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again.
This time of the rolling year I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me? Hear me, my time is nearly gone. I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate. A chance and hope of my procuring, Ebenezer. You will be haunted by 3 spirits.
Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob? I think I'd rather not.
Oh, their visits. You cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1. Expect the second on the next night at the same hour. The third will come the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. look to see me no more, and for your own sake, remember what has passed between us.
The spectre took cloth from the table and bound it round its head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound its teeth made when the jaws were brought together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again, and found his supernatural visitor standing over him, with its chain wound over and about its arm. The apparition walked backward from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped, not so much in obedience, but in surprise and fear. He became aware of incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre joined in the mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge looked out the window. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few were linked together. None were free. Many had been known to Scrooge in their lives. One of these was an old ghost in a white waistcoat, with a monstrous iron safe attached to its ankle. This ghost cried piteously at being unable to help a wretched woman with an infant upon a doorstep. The source of these phantoms' misery was clear. They sought to interfere, for good purpose, in human matters, and had lost that power forever. Then the spirits faded into the mist which enshrouded them, and their voices faded with them. Scrooge closed the window, but found the door was still double locked. He started to say, but stopped at the first syllable. Being, from the fatigues of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the lateness of the hour, he much in need of repose, he went straight to bed, without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant.
When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. He was endeavoring to pierce the darkness with his ferret eyes when the chimes of a neighboring church struck the 4 quarters. He listened for the hour. To his great astonishment, the heavy bell went on from 6 to 7 and from 7 to 8 and regularly up to 12, then stopped. 12? It was past 2 when he went to bed. The clock was wrong. An icicle must have got into the works. 12. He took up his pocket watch. Its rapid little pulse beat 12 and stopped. Scrooge said,
It isn't possible that I've slept through the whole day and far into another night. It isn't possible that something has happened to the sun, and this is 12 at noon.
That idea alarmed him. He scrambled out of bed, groped his way to the window, and rubbed the frost off with the sleeve of his dressing gown so he could see out. Still, all he could make out was that it was still very foggy and extremely cold, and that there was no noise of people making a great commotion. Night had not beaten off bright day and taken possession of the world. This was a great relief. Scrooge was in possession of a bank draft with the instructions, 3 days after sight of this first of exchange, pay to Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge, and so forth. This would become as worthless as a mere United States security if there were no days to count by. Scrooge went to bed again and thought things over. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was, and the more he endeavored not to think, the more he thought. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself that it was all a dream, his mind flew back again and presented the same problem to be worked all through. Was it a dream or not? Scrooge lay in this state until he remembered that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. He resolved to lie awake until the hour was past, and considering that he could no more go to sleep than go to heaven, this was perhaps the wisest resolution in his power. He counted off the quarters as they chimed. At length, the chiming of the hour broke upon his listening ear.
The hour itself, and nothing else.
Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn. Scrooge found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them. It was a strange figure, like a child, and yet as like an old man. It had a child's proportions, yet its beard and long hair, which hung down its back, were white, and yet the face had not a wrinkle, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular. Its legs and feet were most delicately formed. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand. In singular contradiction to that, its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was bright, clear jet of light which sprang from the crown of its head. Its hat was a great candle snuffer, which it now held under its arm. Scrooge asked,
Are you the spirit whose coming was foretold to me?
I am.
Who and what are you?
I am the ghost of Christmas past.
The long past?
No, your past.
Perhaps Scrooge could not have told anybody why, but he had a special desire to see the spirit in its cap, and begged him to be covered.
What? Would you so soon put out with worldly hands the light I give? Is it not enough that you are the one whose passions who made this cap, and forced me to wear it through whole trains of years?
Scrooge reverently disclaimed all intention to offend, or any knowledge of having wilfully bonneted the spirit at any period of his life. He then made bold to inquire what business brought him there.
Your welfare,
said the ghost. Scrooge said he was much obliged, but could not help thinking that a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end. The spirit must have heard him thinking. It put out its strong hand and clasped him gently by the arm.
Rise and walk with me.
Scrooge wanted to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that bed was warm, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap. The grasp, though gentle, was not to be resisted. He rose, but saw that the spirit made toward the window. Scrooge remonstrated.
I am mortal and liable to fall.
Bear but a touch of my hand. There.
Said the spirit, laying it upon his heart.
And you shall be upheld in more than this.
They passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road with fields on either hand. The city had vanished, and its darkness and the mist with it. It was a clear, cold, winter day with snow upon the ground. Clasping his hands together, Scrooge said,
Good heaven, I was a boy here.
He was conscious of 1,000 odors floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares long, long forgotten.
Your lip is trembling. And what is that upon your cheek? Do you recollect the way?
Remember it. I could walk it blindfolded. Strange to have forgotten it for so many years. Let us go on.
They walked, and Scrooge recognized every gate and tree. A little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, and winding river. Boys on ponies called to other boys in carts, driven by farmers. All were in great spirits, shouting to each other until the broad fields were so full of merry music and the crisp air laughed to hear it.
These are but shadows of the things that have been. They are not aware of us.
The happy travelers passed by. Scrooge named every one of them. He rejoiced to see them. His cold eye glistened. His heart leapt, filling him with gladness as the boys wished each other a Merry Christmas and parted for their several homes. But what was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? What good had it ever done to him?
The school is not quite deserted. A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still.
Scrooge sobbed.
I know.
Soon they approached a dull red brick mansion, a large house, but one of broken fortunes. The walls were damp and mossy, their windows broken, and their gates decayed. The stables and sheds were overrun with grass. They entered. There was an earthy savor and chilly bareness in the place, which spoke of too much getting up by candlelight and not too much to eat. They went to a room at the back of the house where a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge wept to see his poor, forgotten self as he used to be. The spirit touched him on the arm and pointed to his younger self, intent upon his reading. Suddenly, a man in foreign garments, wonderfully real and distinct to look at, stood outside the window with an axe stuck in his belt and leading by the bridle an ass laden with wood.
Why, it's dear old honest Ali Baba. Yeah, I know. Oh, one Christmas time when I was left here all alone, he came just like that. And Valentine and his wild brother Orson, there they go. Oh, what's his name? Who was put down in his drawers asleep at the gate of Damascus. Don't you see him? and the Sultan's groom turned upside down by the genie. There he is upon his head. Serves him right. What business had he to be married to the princess?
To hear Scrooge expending all the earnestness of his nature on such subjects, between laughing and crying, to see his heightened and excited face, would have been a surprise to his business friends at the exchange. Then he said, in pity for his former self, "Poor boy," and he cried again.
What is the matter?
Nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should like to have given him something, that's all.
Let us see another Christmas.
Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and dirtier. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked. Fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling. Scrooge saw that there he was, alone again, when all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays. Scrooge looked at the ghost, shook his head mournfully, and glanced anxiously towards the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in and putting her arms about his neck and often kissing him, addressed him as her "Dear, dear brother." "I have come to bring you home, dear brother," said the child, clapping her tiny hands and bending down to laugh. "To bring you home, home, home."
Home, little fan.
Yes, said the child, brimful of glee. Home, for good and all. Home, forever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be, that home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed, that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home. And he said, yes, you should, and sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're to be a man, said the child, opening her eyes, and are never to come back here. But first, we're to be together all the Christmas long and have the merriest time in all the world.
You are quite a woman, little Fan.
She clapped her hands and laughed and tried to touch his head, but being too little, laughed again and stood on tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him in her childish eagerness towards the door, and he, nothing loth to go, accompanied her. A terrible voice in the hall cried, "Bring down Master Scrooge's box there!" And in the hall appeared the schoolmaster himself, who glared on Master Scrooge with a ferocious condescension, and threw him into a dreadful state of mind by shaking hands with him. He then conveyed him and his sister into the veriest old, shivering parlor that ever was seen, where the maps upon the wall and the celestial and terrestrial globes in the windows were waxy with cold. Here he produced a decanter of curiously light wine and a block of curiously heavy cake, and administered installments of those dainties to the young people, at the same time sending out a meager servant to offer a glass of something to the postboy, who answered that he thanked the gentleman, but if it was the same tap as he had tasted before, he had rather not. Master Scrooge's trunk being by this time tied onto the top of the chaise, the children bade the schoolmaster good-bye right wailingly, and getting into it, drove gaily down the garden sweep, the quick wheels dashing the hoar-frost and snow from off the dark leaves of the evergreens like spray.
Always a delicate creature, whom a breath might have withered, but she had a large heart.
So she had, you're right. I'll not gainsay it, Spirit, God forbid.
She died a woman, and had, as I think, children.
One child.
Your nephew.
Yes, my nephew.
Although they had but a moment ago left the school behind them, they were now in the busy thoroughfares of a city, where shadowy passengers passed and repassed, where shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way, and the strife and the tumult of the real city were. It was made plain enough by the dressings of the shops that here too it was Christmas time again. But it was evening, and the streets were lighted up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it.
Know it? I was apprenticed here. The old gentleman in the Welsh wig sitting behind the high desk. Oh, it's old Fezziwig. Ah, bless his heart, it's Fezziwig alive again.
Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock and called out in a jovial voice, "Yo ho there, my boys! Ebenezer, Dick, no more work tonight. It is Christmas Eve." The floor was swept and watered. The lamps were trimmed. The fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was snug and warm and dry, and bright a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler. In came 3 beaming, lovable Miss Fezziwigs. In came the 6 young followers whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook with her brother's friend, the milkman. In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some graceful, some awkward. There were more dances, and there were guessing games, and more dances, and there was cake, and there was a great roast, and a ham, and there were mince pies and plenty of beer. At one point, old Fezziwig clapped his hands and stopped the dance, cried out, "Well done!" And the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter, especially provided for that purpose. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Miss Fezziwig shook hands with every guest and wished him or her a Merry Christmas. During this whole time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene. He remembered everything, enjoyed everything, underwent the strangest agitation. It was not until now, when the bright faces of his former self and Dick were turned from them, that he remembered that the ghost was looking upon him.
A small matter to make these silly folks so full of gratitude. He has spent so little of your mortal money, perhaps 3 or 4 pounds. Is that so much to deserve your praise? He has the power to render you happy or unhappy, to make your service light or burdensome. Yet the happiness he gives is as great as if it cost a fortune. What is the matter?
I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now, that's all.
His former self turned down the lamps, and Scrooge and the ghost again stood side by side in the open air.
My time grows short.
I see myself. I am older, in the prime of life.
Your face has not the harsh lines of later years, but it begins to wear the signs of worry and avarice. Yet there is an eager, greedy, restless motion in your eye which shows the passion that has taken root, and where the shadow of the growing tree will fall.
There is a fair young girl. She is wearing the black of mourning. There are tears in her eyes which sparkle in the light that shines out of you, ghost of Christmas past. She says another idol has displeased her. What idol has displaced you? She says a golden one has. She has seen my nobler aspirations fall off one by one, until now gold is my master passion. She says our contract is an old one, made when we were both poor and content to be so, that I am now another man. She releases me from our engagement with a full heart for the love of the man I once was. Spirit, take me home. Why do you delight to torture me? Show me no more.
One shadow more.
The ghost pinioned him in both his arms and forced him to observe what happened next.
I see another room, not very large or handsome, but it looks comfortable. There she is again, sitting by the fire. No, there she is, sitting opposite the girl. She's older now, but still very comely. The girl is a daughter. There are more children here, more than I can count. The noise is tumultuous. Such an uproar, yet no one seems to mind, and she and the young girl are laughing and joining in the sports. Oh, Spirit, I should dearly like to have touched her lips, to have looked upon the lashes of her downcast eyes, to have let loose waves of hair, an inch of which would be a keepsake beyond price. I should like to have had the slightest license of a child, and yet have been the man enough to know its value. The door is opening. That must be her husband. He's carrying Christmas presents. Oh, it's a madhouse. He's giving out the packages.
Scrooge watched in rapt attention for some time, while each gift was received and opened.
It is over. The children are going to bed. Her husband says that today He saw her old friend, Mr. Scrooge. Me! He says he passed my office window, that I was working at my desk, while my partner lay dying in his bed at home. He says I look quite alone in the world. Spirit, remove me from this place. Haunt me no longer.
I told you that these were shadows of the things that have been. They are what they are. Do not blame me.
Remove me. I cannot bear it.
He turned upon the ghost. In its face were fragments of all the faces it had shown him. Scrooge wrestled with the ghost. Scrooge observed that its light was burning high and bright. He seized the extinguisher cap and by sudden action pressed it down upon its head. The spirit dropped beneath it so that the candle snuffer covered its whole form, but it could not hide the light which had streamed from under it. Scrooge was in his own bedroom. He was exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness. He gave a cap a parting squeeze and had barely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep.
Scrooge awoke in the middle of a tremendously tough snore and sat up in bed to get his thoughts together. He had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of 1. He felt that he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time for the special purpose of holding a conference with the second messenger dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's intervention. He grew uncomfortably cold at the thought of the new spectre pulling back the bed curtains, so he put them aside with his own hands. This accomplished, he lay down again and established a sharp lookout all around the bed. He did not want to be taken by surprise. Scrooge was ready for a good broad field of strange appearances, and nothing between a baby and a rhinoceros would have astonished him very much. Being prepared for almost anything, he was by no means prepared for nothing. When the bell struck 1 and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour went by, yet nothing came. All this time he lay upon his bed at the center of a blaze of ruddy light, which streamed upon it when the clock proclaimed the hour. Being only light, it was more alarming than a dozen ghosts, as he was powerless to make out what it meant. And he was afraid that at any moment he might become an interesting case of spontaneous combustion without having the consolation of knowing it. At last, however, he began to think, as you or I would have thought from the first, that the source of this ghostly light might be in the adjoining room, from whence it seemed to shine. He got up and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by his name and bade him enter. He obeyed. It was his own room. There was no doubt about that. But it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were so hung with greenery that it looked like a perfect grove. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected the light of a mighty blaze that went roaring up the chimney. That dull hearth had never known such a fire in Scrooge's time, nor Marley's either. and heaped up on the floor to form a kind of throne were all manner of game birds and great joints of meat, suckling pigs, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, delicious fruits, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch there sat a smiling giant. Glorious to see, he raised high a glowing torch shaped like Plenty's horn, which shed its light on Scrooge. The spirit's eyes were clear and kind, but Scrooge did not like to meet them.
Come in and know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas present. You have never seen the like of me before.
It was clothed in one simple blue robe, bordered with white fur. The robe hung so loosely that its breast was bare. Girded around its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust.
Have you never walked forth with the younger members of my family? By which I mean my older brothers, for I am very young.
I am afraid I have not. Have you had many brothers, Spirit?
More than 1,800.
Spirit, conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learned a lesson. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it.
Touch my robe.
Scrooge held fast to the robe. The room and all its contents vanished instantly, and the two stood in the city streets on a snowy Christmas morning.
The house fronts and the windows were black, contrasting with a white sheet of snow upon the roofs and with the dirtier snow upon the ground. The wheels of carts plowed deep in the snow, making complicated channels which were hard to trace in the thick yellow mud and icy water. The sky was gloomy, and the streets were choked with a dingy mist which descended in a shower of soot. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate or the town. Yet, the people who were shoveling away on the housetops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another from the rooftops, and now and again exchanging snowballs, laughing heartily if it went right, and not less heartily if it went wrong. The shops were still half open and were radiant in their glory. There were great, round, pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts, shaped like the waistcoats of jolly old gentlemen, lolling at the doors and tumbling out into the street in their apoplectic opulence. Everything was good to eat and in its Christmas dress. The customers were also hurried and eager in the hopeful promise of the day, all in the best humor possible. Soon, the steeples called good people to church, and they flocked through the streets in their best clothes with their gayest faces. And at the same time, there emerged from the scores of by streets innumerable people carrying their dinners to the bakers' shops. The spirit stood with Scrooge beside him in a baker's doorway and sprinkled incense on the dinners from his torch. Once or twice, when there were angry words between some dinner carriers, he shed a few drops of water on them, and their good humor was restored directly, for they said it was a shame to fight upon Christmas Day. And so it was. God love it, so it was. Scrooge asked,
Would the sprinklings from your torch apply to any kind of dinner on this day?
To any kindly given, to that of a poor one most, because it needs it most.
Spirit, why should you desire to deprive these people of their means of dining on Sundays, often the only day on which they can be said to dine at all? You seek to close these places on Sunday. Forgive me if I'm wrong. It has been done in your name, or at least in that of your family.
There are some upon this earth of yours who claim to know us and who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are as strange to us and all of our kith and kin, as if they had never lived. Remember that, and charge their doings on themselves, not us.
Scrooge promised that he would, and they went on, invisible. Perhaps the good spirit was showing off this power of his, or else it was his own generous nature and his sympathy with all poor men that led him straight to Bob Cratchit's house. On the threshold of the door, the spirit stopped to bless the dwelling with the sprinkling of his torch. Think of that. Bob pocketed but 15 bob a week himself, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his 4-room house. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, dressed poorly but brave in ribbons, which make a good show for a sixpence. She laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, while Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes. The shirt collar Bob had conferred upon Peter in honor of the day was much too large for him, and the corners got into his mouth. He rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, a boy and a girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelled the goose and known it for their own, and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion.
What has ever got your father and Tiny Tim then? And Martha warn't as late last Christmas Day.
Here's Martha, mother, said a girl, appearing as she spoke.
Why, bless your heart, my dear, how late you are.
She kissed Martha a dozen times and took off her shawl and bonnet with a zeal. Martha replied, "Oh, we'd a great deal of work to finish up last night and had to clear away this morning, mother."
Well, never mind, so long as you're come. Sit ye down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm, Lord bless ye.
"Oh no, there's father coming," cried the 2 young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide." So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob. At least 3 feet of comforter hung down before him. His threadbare clothes were darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and he carried Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Tiny Tim bore a little crutch, and his limbs were supported with an iron frame.
"Why, where's our Martha?"
Not coming.
Bob's spirits dropped.
"Not coming? Not coming upon Christmas Day?"
Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, even only in a joke, and so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the 2 young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash house that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. Mrs. Cratchit rallied Bob on his credulity and then asked,
"And how did little Tim behave?"
"Oh, as good as gold and better. He gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much, he thinks the strangest things you've ever heard. He told me that he hoped that people saw him at church, because he was crippled, and it might be pleasant for them to remember on Christmas who it was that made the lame walk and blind men see."
Bob's voice trembled when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty.
Before another word was spoken, Tiny Tim was escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire, and while Bob turned up his cuffs and compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons and put it on the hob to simmer, Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy hissing hot, and Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody and mounting guard upon their own places. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause. Mrs. Cratchit plunged the carving knife into the breast, and the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth. A murmur of delight arose, and even Tiny Tim beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hooray!" Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Everyone had had enough, but now the plates were changed by Belinda. Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witnesses, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough? Suppose it should break in turning out? Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose? This thought made the two young Cratchits livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hallo, a great deal of steam! The pudding was out of the copper. In half a minute Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed, but smiling proudly with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top. Bob Cratchit said that he regarded the pudding as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. At last the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth. Bob served the compound with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed,
"A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us."
Which all the family re-echoed.
God bless us, everyone.
He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him.
Spirit, tell me if Tiny Tim will live.
I see a vacant seat in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die.
No, no, oh, no, kind spirit, say he will be spared.
If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race will find him here. What then? If he's going to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population.
Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief.
Man, if man you be in heart, you must discover what the surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? In the sight of heaven, you may be more worthless, less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. O God, to hear the insect on a leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust.
Scrooge trembled before the ghost's rebuke and cast his eyes upon the ground. Bob said,
I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast.
The founder of the feast, indeed. I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it.
Oh, my dear, the children, Christmas Day.
It should be Christmas Day on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. Nobody knows it better than you do, Robert.
My dear, Christmas Day.
I'll drink his health, for your sake, and the day is not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year.
The children drank the toast after her. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care tuppence for it. The mention of Scrooge's name cast a dark shadow on the party for full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge the Baleful being done with. Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Peter, which could bring in full 5 and 6pence weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed at the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, told them what kind of work she had to do, and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how, tomorrow being a holiday, she meant to lie in bed in the morning for a good long rest. All this time the chestnuts and the jug went round, and by they had a song about a lost child traveling in the snow from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sang it very well indeed. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, but they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. Without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and desert moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about, as though it were the burial place of giants. Water stood in puddles and would have spread itself everywhere but for the frost that held it prisoner, and nothing grew but moss and coarse grass. The setting sun had left a streak of fiery red, which glared upon the desolation for an instant like a sullen eye, and then frowning lower, lower yet, was lost in the thick gloom of darkest night.
What place is this?
A place where miners live, who labor in the bowels of the earth, but they know me. See?
A light shone from the window of a hut, and they advanced swiftly towards it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled round a glowing fire. An old man and woman with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. In a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, the old man sang a Christmas song. It had been a very old song when he was a boy, and they all joined in the chorus. When they raised their voices, the old man sang more loudly, and when they stopped, his vigor sank again. The spirit bade Scrooge hold his robe, and passing on above the moor, sped to sea. To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw the last of the land behind them. The thundering water rolled and roared and raged among the dreadful caverns it had worn, and fiercely tried to undermine the earth. Upon a dismal reef, some league or so from shore, there stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and storm birds rose and fell about it like the waves that they skimmed. But even here, two men who watched the light had made a fire that through the loophole in the thick stone wall shed out a ray of brightness on the awful sea. Joining their hands over the rough table at which they sat, they wished each other Merry Christmas in their can of grog, and one of them, the elder, struck up a sturdy song that was like a gale in itself.
The ghost sped on above the black and heaving sea until, being far away from any shore, they lighted on a ship. The helmsman at the wheel, the lookout in the bow. The officers were dark, ghostly figures. But every man among them hummed a Christmas tune or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day with homeward hopes belonging to it. Every man on board, waking or sleeping, good or bad, had a kinder word for another on that day than on any day in the year. Scrooge listened to the moaning of the wind and thought what a solemn thing it was to move through the lonely darkness over an abyss whose depths were secrets as profound as death. It was a great surprise to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to hear his own nephew Fred's laugh, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by his side. Scrooge's nephew laughed. If you should happen, by any unlikely chance, to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is, I should like to know him too. There is infection in disease and sorrow, and there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. When Scrooge's nephew laughed, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face in the most extravagant contortions, Fred's wife and their assembled friends laughed as heartily as he. Scrooge's nephew cried,
He said that Christmas was a humbug. As I live, he believed it too.
More shame on him, Fred, said his wife indignantly. She was very pretty, extremely pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking, capital face and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw.
He's a comical fellow, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offenses carry. However, his offenses carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. His wealth is no use to him. He doesn't do any good with it. He doesn't make himself comfortable with it. He certainly hasn't the satisfaction of thinking that he's ever going to benefit us with it. I am sorry for him. Couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. I am sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his own moldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him. If he finds me going there year after year and saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? If it only puts him of a mind to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something. And I think I shook him yesterday.
They passed the bottle joyously. Afterwards, they had some music. Fred's wife played a simple tune upon the harp, a tune which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school. When this strain of music sounded, all the things that the ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened often,
Years ago, he might have cultivated the kindnesses of life for his own happiness with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton's spade that buried Jacob Marley. He begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guests departed. But this, the spirit said, could not be done. Scrooge said,
1/2 hour, spirit, only one.
The revelers played a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must ask yes or no questions to learn what it was. Their questioning elicited from him that he was thinking of a savage and rather disagreeable animal that growled, sometimes grunted or talked, and walked about the streets of London, and wasn't made a show of or led by anybody, and didn't live in a menagerie, and was never killed at market, and was not any animal they named. At every question, Fred burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last, one of the guests cried out, I know what it is, Fred. It's your Uncle Scrooge. Which it certainly was. Some objected that the reply to, Is it a bear? Should have been yes.
He has given us plenty of merriment, and it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine, and I say, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, whatever he is. He wouldn't take it from me, but may he have it nevertheless. Uncle Scrooge.
Scrooge's heart lightened, and he would have toasted the company in return and thanked them in an inaudible speech if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. They visited many homes. The spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful. On foreign lands, and they were close to home. By struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope. By poverty, and it was rich. In almshouse, hospital, and jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door. The spirit left his blessing and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, and it was strange that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost clearly grew older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it until they left the children's 12th night party.
A spirit's lives so short.
My life upon this globe is very brief. It ends tonight at midnight. Hark, the time is drawing near.
The chimes were ringing 11:03 at that moment. Scrooge looked intently at the spirit's robe and said,
Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask. But below your skirts, is that a claw I see? Is that yours?
From the folds of its robe, it brought 2 children, wretched, frightful, hideous. They knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garment.
Look down here, man.
They were a boy and a girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints, a stale and shriveled hand, like that of age, had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked. No perversion of humanity through all the mysteries of wonderful creation has created monsters half so horrible. Scrooge started back, appalled. He tried to say they were fine children, but the words choked themselves rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude. He could say no more than,
Spirit, are they yours?
They are man's. The boy is ignorance. The girl is want. Beware them both, but most of all beware the boy, for on his brow is written doom. Unless the writing be erased, deny it. Slander those who say it. Admit it for your own factious purposes and make it worse, and abide the end.
Have they no refuge or resource?
Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?
the ghost shrunk down and dwindled into a bedpost. The bells struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him.
Slowly, gravely, silently, the spirit approached Scrooge, bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which this spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible, save one outstretched hand. But for this, it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded. It was tall and stately, and its presence filled Scrooge with a solemn dread. He knew no more, for the spirit neither spoke nor moved.
Am I in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come?
The spirit did not answer, but pointed downward with its hand. Scrooge asked,
You are about to show me the shadows of things that have not happened, but will happen in the time before us.
The folds of the upper portion of the spirit's garment contracted for an instant, as if the spirit had nodded. That was its only answer. Although well used to ghostly company by this time, Scrooge feared the silent shape so much that his legs trembled beneath him, and he found that he could hardly stand when he prepared to follow it. The spirit paused a moment and gave him time to recover.
Ghost of the future, I fear you more than any spectre I have seen. But as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I will follow you and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me?
It gave him no reply, but its hand was pointed straight before them. Then it moved away. Scrooge followed in the shadow of its dress, which seemed to bear him up and carry him along. The city seemed to spring up about them and encompass them. They were in the heart of the exchange, amongst the merchants who hurried up and down and chinked the money in their pockets, and conversed in groups, and looked at their watches. Scrooge had seen them often. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen, and Scrooge listened to their talk. "No," said a great fat man with a monstrous chin, I don't know much about it. Either way, I only know he's dead." "When did he die?" inquired another. Last night, I believe." "What was the matter with him? I thought he'd never die." God knows, said the first with a yawn. What has he done with his money? Asked a red-faced gentleman. He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know, said the large-chinned one. It's likely to be a very cheap funeral, for upon my life I don't know of anybody who will attend. I don't mind going if a lunch is provided, observed the red-faced gentleman. The men laughed. The phantom glided on into a street. Its finger pointed to two persons meeting. Scrooge knew these men. They were men of business, very wealthy and of great importance. He had made a point of always standing with them in their esteem, strictly in a business point of view. One of the men spoke. Well, Old Scratch has got his own at last. So I am told. Gold, isn't it? Seasonable for Christmas time. You're not a skater, I suppose. No, something else to think of. Good morning. Not another word. That was their meeting, their conversation, and their parting. Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the spirit should attach such importance to such apparently trivial conversations. They could not have had any bearing on the death of Jacob, his old partner, for that was past. This ghost's province was the future, nor could he think of anyone immediately connected with himself to whom he could apply them. He did not doubt that they had some moral for his own improvement, whomsoever they applied to. He resolved to treasure every word he heard and everything he saw. He expected the conduct of his future self would give him the clue he had missed. They went into a part of town where Scrooge had never penetrated before. Although he recognized its bad repute, the ways were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people half naked, drunken, slipshod, ugly. The whole quarter reeked with crime, with filth, and with misery.
They came to a low-browed, beetling shop. Upon the floor within were piled up heaps of rusty keys, nails, chains, and scrap iron of all kinds. Sitting by a charcoal stove was a gray-haired rascal who must have been nearly 70. He was smoking his pipe in all the luxury of calm retirement. A charwoman slunk into the shop carrying a heavy bundle. Then came a laundress, similarly laden. She was followed by an undertaker in faded black. They were startled by the recognition of each other. After a brief period of blank astonishment, all three burst into a laugh. The charwoman spoke. Why, look here, old Joe. If we three haven't met without meaning to, what are the chances? The old man took his pipe from his mouth and said, You couldn't have met in a better place. Come into the parlor. The charwoman threw her bundles on the floor and said, We all have a right to take care of ourselves. He always did. A dead man's no worse for the loss of a few things. If he wanted to keep them after he was dead, he'd have had somebody to look after him when he died. Instead, he gasped his last, alone by himself. The laundress said, That's the truest word that ever was spoke. It's a judgment on him. The charwoman replied, I wish it was a heavier judgment, and it would have been if I could have laid my hands on anything else. We helped ourselves, and it's no sin. Open the bundle, Joe, and tell me the value of it. The undertaker produced a small plunder, a couple of seals, a pencil case, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no great value. Old Joe chalked the sums he was disposed to give for each upon the wall and added them up into a total. He said, I wouldn't give another sixpence if I was to be boiled for not doing it. Who's next? The laundress was next. Sheets and towels, a little wearing apparel, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her account was totaled on the wall. I always give too much to ladies. It's a weakness of mine, but if you asked for another penny, I'd repent of being so liberal and knock off half a crown. Joe went down on his knees and unfastened the charwoman's bundle. It was bed curtains and blankets. Joe said, "You took all of this with him lying there? You was born to make your fortune, and you'll certainly do it." The charwoman replied, "I certainly shan't stay mine when I can get anything in it. Not for the sake of a man such as he was. I dare say he isn't likely to catch cold without him." Ha ha ha! Old Joe replied, "I hope he didn't die of anything catching. I ain't so fond of his company that I'd loiter about him for such things if he did." Scrooge shuddered.
Spirit, the case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now.
The scene changed. Scrooge recoiled in terror. The room was very dark. A pale light fell upon a bare, uncurtained bed. Beneath a ragged sheet, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of a man. No voice spoke, yet when Scrooge looked upon the bed, he heard these words: "Oh, cold, cold, rigid, dreadful death, set up thine altar here, and dress it with such terrors as thou hast at thy command. For this is thy dominion. But of the loved, revered, and honored head, thou canst not turn one hair to thy dread purposes, or make one feature odious. It is not that the hand is heavy and will fall down when released. It is not that the heart and pulse are still, but that the hand was open, generous, and true, the heart brave, warm, and tender, and the pulse a man's. Strike, shadow, strike, and see his good deeds springing from the wound to sow the world with life immortal." He lay in the dark, empty house, with not a man or woman or child to say of the dead man, "He has been kind to me in this or that." No one to say that, for the memory of even one kindness, they would be kind to him. Scrooge thought that avarice and hard dealing had truly brought the man to a rich end. Rats gnawed beneath the hearthstone. Scrooge did not dare to think what they wanted in that room of death, or why they were so restless and disturbed. He said,
"Spirit, in leaving this fearful place, I shall not leave its lesson. Let us go."
The ghost pointed to the man's head. The slightest raising of the sheet would have disclosed the man's face. Scrooge said,
"I cannot do it. I do not have the power. Spirit, if there is any person in this town who feels emotion for this man's death, show that person to me."
The phantom spread its dark robe before him like a wing, and withdrawing it, revealed a room by daylight. A young family sat at dinner. The wife asked her husband, "Is there any news?" He looked embarrassed to answer, "There is hope yet." "If he relents," she said. "He is past relenting. He is dead. I don't know to who our debt will be transferred, but we shall be ready for the money, and even though we were not, it would be bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor in his successor. we may sleep tonight with lighter hearts. Yes, soften it as they would, their hearts were lighter. The faces of the children, who understood so little, were brighter, and it was a happier house for this man's death. The only emotion that the ghost could show him was joy.
Let me see some tenderness connected with death, or that dark chamber we just left will be forever present to me.
Quiet. Very quiet. The mother laid her embroidery upon the table. She said,
The color hurts my eyes, makes them weak by candlelight, and I wouldn't for the world show weak eyes to your father when he comes home. He's past his time to be home.
Peter answered, I think he's walked a little slower than he used to these last few evenings, Mother.
I've known him walk very fast indeed with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder, but Tim was very light to carry, and your father loved him so that it was no trouble. And there's your father at the door.
Bob came in, wearing his comforter. He had need of it, poor fellow. He was very cheerful with his family. He looked at the work upon the table and praised the speed and industry of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said.
You went today, then, Robert?
Yes, my dear. I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. My little child. No, my little child.
He broke down all at once. He composed himself, and they drew about the fire and talked, the girls and the mother working still.
Oh, I met Mr. Scrooge's nephew in the street today. He's extraordinarily kind. We had met but once, and he saw that I looked just a little down, you know. He inquired what had happened to distress me. Oh, he's the pleasantest spoken gentleman you've ever heard. I told him, and he said, I am heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit. He said, heartily sorry for your good wife. However, did he know that you are a good wife?
Everybody knows that, said Peter.
Very well observed, my boy. I hope they do. He said, heartily sorry, and if he can be of any service to me in any way, and he gave me his card. That's where I live, he said. Pray come to me. It really seemed that he had known our Tiny Tim and had grieved with us.
Mrs. Cratchit kissed him. His daughters kissed him. The two young Cratchits kissed him, and Peter and himself shook hands. Spirit of Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God.
Spectre, something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. Tell me what man that was whom we saw lying dead.
The ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed him to the counting house and pointed. Scrooge hastened to the window and looked in. It was still an office, but not his office. The furniture was different, and the figure at the desk was not himself. The inexorable finger still pointed. Then they traveled until they reached an iron gate before a churchyard. The spirit pointed down to one grave. Scrooge advanced toward it, trembling.
Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of things that will be, or are they the shadows of things that may be only?
Still, the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood.
Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends to which, if persevered in, they must lead. But if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it is thus with what you show me.
The spirit was as immovable as ever. Scrooge crept toward the grave, trembling as he went, and, following the finger, read the name upon the stone. Ebenezer Scrooge.
No, spirit, no, no. Hear me. I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been but for this intercourse. Why show me this if I am past all hope?
For the first time, the hand appeared to shake. The kind hand trembled.
I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me I may sponge away the writing on this stone.
In Scrooge's agony, he caught the spectral hand. It sought to free itself. But Scrooge was strong in his pleading and detained it. The spirit, stronger yet, repulsed him. Holding up his hands in a last prayer to have his fate reversed, Scrooge watched the phantom as it shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost.
The bedpost was his own. Scrooge was in his own bed. Time was his own to make amends in.
Yes. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. Oh, Jacob Marley, heaven and the Christmas time be praised for this. The bed curtains are not torn down. They are not torn down. They are here, and I am here. The shadows of the things that would have been may be dispelled. I know they will.
His face was wet with tears. Scrooge laughed and cried in the same breath as he put on his garments. He had danced into the sitting room and was now standing there, perfectly winded.
I am as light as a feather. I'm as happy as an angel. I'm as merry as a schoolboy. I am as giddy as a drunken man. A Merry Christmas to everybody. A Happy New Year to all the world. There's the door by which the ghost of Jacob Marley entered. And there's the corner where the ghost of Christmas present sat. And there's the window where I saw the wandering spirits. It's all right. It's all true. It all happened.
Oh, he laughed in what would be the father of a long, long line of laughs. And really, for a man who had been so out of practice for so many years, it was a splendid laugh, a most illustrious laugh. Church bells rang out more enthusiastically than he had ever heard. Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog, no mist, clear and cold, bright, golden sunlight
heavenly sky. He called out to a young boy.
Oh, what's today, my fine fellow?
The boy answered, Today? Why, it's Christmas Day.
It's Christmas Day? I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. Well, they can do anything they like. Hello, my fine fellow. Do you know the poulterers in the next street?
I should hope I did.
Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? The big one.
The one as big as me? It's hanging there now.
Tell them Ebenezer Scrooge wants it delivered to Bob Cratchit in Camden Town. Tell them to bring it here, that I may give them directions. You come back with the man, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, and I'll give you half a crown.
The boy was off like a shot and returned a moment later, along with the poulterer's man and a bird that Scrooge thought must be twice the size of Tiny Tim. It was far too big to be carried it all the way to Camden Town. Scrooge chuckled when he paid for the turkey, and when he paid the boy, and when he paid for the cab for the poulterer's man to deliver the turkey.
Scrooge dressed himself all in his best, and at last got out into the streets to enjoy a beautiful Christmas day. Scrooge regarded everyone he met with a delighted smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant that 3 or 4 good-humored fellows said, "Good morning, sir, a Merry Christmas to you." And Scrooge said often afterwards that of all the happiest sounds he had ever heard, those were the happiest in his ears. He had not gone far when he beheld a portly gentleman who had walked into his counting-house the day before. Scrooge said,
My dear sir, a Merry Christmas to you. Allow me to ask your pardon, and will you have the goodness?
Then Scrooge whispered in his ear. "Lord bless me, my dear Mr. Scrooge, are you serious?" cried the gentleman.
If you please, and not a farthing less. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. I am much obliged to you. Bless you.
He went to church and walked about the streets and watched the people hurrying to and fro and patted children on the head and questioned beggars and looked down into the kitchens of houses and up into windows and found that everything could yield him pleasure. He had never dreamed that any walk, that anything, could give him so much happiness.
In the afternoon, Scrooge turned his steps towards his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock, but he made a dash and did it. The girl who answered the door offered to show him to the dining room, but Scrooge simply stepped inside.
Thank you. He knows me. Fred, it's I, your Uncle Scrooge. I have come to dinner. Will you let me in?
Let him in? It's a mercy Fred didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. All the guests who were there when he visited the spirit came in. They had a wonderful party, wonderful games, and wonderful happiness. But he was early at the office the next morning to catch Bob Cratchit coming in late. The clock struck 9. No Bob. A quarter past. No Bob. Scrooge's clerk was a full 18 and a half minutes behind his time, taking off his hat and his comforter as he came through the door.
I'm very sorry, sir. I'm behind my time. It's only once a year. It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry last night, sir.
Hello. Is that why you are coming in here at this time of day? Now, I'll tell you what, my friend, I am not going to stand for this sort of thing any longer, and therefore I am about to raise your salary. Ah, Merry Christmas, Bob. Merry Christmas that I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavor to assist your struggling family, and we will discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of mulled wine. Make up the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit.
Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he became a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the change in him, but he little heeded them. It was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well. If any man alive possessed that knowledge, may it be truly said of us, all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone.